His symphonies redefined a genre thought dead, and in the so-called land without music, no less. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Ralph Vaughan Williams. Yes, it's Ralph. Get used to it. Ralph Vaughan Williams was born in October 1872 in the southwest of England, near Wales. His father was a vicar, and the entire family held relatively liberal views on various issues of the day, unsurprising given that his uncle was none other than Charles Darwin. His musical training was mostly on the violin. He didn't really care for the piano, which was his aunt's instrument. It's telling that in his compositional career, he would mostly avoid writing for solo piano. But he did like the violin quite a bit, and in fact, this once landed him in some hot water at his boarding school. He got out his violin and started playing it after dark, which incited all of his bunkmates to start dancing, and then the headmaster had to come in and shut the party down.
Stop being so silly!
When Vaughan Williams was 17, he graduated from his boarding school and enrolled at the Royal College of Music. His composition teacher there was Hubert Parry, and Parry instilled in the young Vaughan Williams a deep appreciation for the British choral tradition. England was known unfairly as the land without music, primarily because, for many generations, since the death of Henry Purcell back in the Baroque era, they had not really had an established composer who got fame outside of England itself. They didn't have any internationally known composers of symphonies, or operas, or even chamber music. What they had was a great choral tradition, and they had great church music to go along with it. They weren't without music so much as they were without the kind of music that Europe expected of its constituent countries. Because they had great church music, this kept choruses and organists very busy. And Hubert Parry was known as one of the foremost choral composers of his day, even though he didn't really like being known as that. Vaughan Williams was, unfortunately, unable to complete a full course of study under Parry because, due to pressure from his family, he left the Royal College and instead started studying at Cambridge. He eventually made it back to RCM, but at that point, Parry was no longer the composition professor. He was now the director of the institution, and the new composition professor was Charles Villiers Stanford, known for enacting apparently back-breaking lessons on his pupils. The truth was that Stanford had a very fierce reputation as being a staunch conservative, but even though he would go toe-to-toe with his students who wanted to write more modernist pieces, he was still going to be in their corner if they wanted to write something that he didn't understand. Stanford's more conservative tastes were tempered by his desire to do right by all of his students. As a result, while Vaughan Williams and Stanford disagreed in the realm of musical aesthetics, Stanford was very much in Vaughan Williams' corner when it came to promoting his pupil and getting his music out there. The choral tradition would become a part of the hallmark of Vaughan Williams' style, tempered as it was through all of the other things that he was interested in, and the fact that he didn't just write choral music, but you can see choral textures and that influence pop up even in his purely instrumental textures. As that kind of music permeated English musical culture, so too did it permeate the musical aesthetics of other RCM students, especially fellow students of Stanford. Gustav Holst's choral music is some of his finest work, for instance, and he and Vaughan Williams got along famously at the Royal College. His circle included many intellectuals who weren't necessarily musicians, owing to his time at Cambridge, and they rallied around the works of modernist artists, such as the poetry of Walt Whitman. And you might wonder why he was sent up to Cambridge in there for a few years, and the answer is that his family was very supportive, but they also thought that he sucked at music. They just didn't want to tell him. They wanted him to have a well-rounded education so that when he came to the conclusion that he sucked at it, he would have a backup career. Fortunately for him and us, his family never told him how terrible he was. Though Vaughan Williams, like his teacher Parry, was an avowed agnostic, who once claimed that he didn't think anyone actually believed in higher powers, he was still, funnily enough, very active in the musical life of the Anglican Church. His hymn tunes are still in use by many major denominations, which is kinda weird. This might stir up some cognitive dissonance in other composers, but Vaughan Williams truly believed in the power of music and the social power of music and the aesthetics of the church. He loved church music, He just didn't necessarily believe in the church doctrine. All the same, I still can't help but remember this disconnect whenever I have to play for all the saints. He deeply appreciated the traditions of the church and the beautiful flowing verse of the King James Bible. He once said that there was no reason an atheist couldn't write a good mass. And he actually did end up writing a pretty good mass. Just as Vaughan Williams appreciated a good English church tune, he also appreciated a good English folk tune. And to that end, he was one of many composers who went out into the countryside with the express purpose of recording these folk tunes before they died away completely. However, in the case of many other composers who did this, such as Percy Grainger, who wasn't even English but yet still recorded these English folk tunes, their ethnomusicological interests were divorced in some way from their compositional interests. Even though you would see settings of folk tunes in other composers' completed pieces, especially in the case of Grainger, what they did in the field was very meticulous. They made sure they got down every single verse, every single note, and in some cases, they made sure even the intonation was right. If something was slightly out of tune, they would make note of that. In Vaughan Williams' case, he didn't really care so much for the exact intricacies of the songs. And as a result, when he went out into the field, he would sometimes just record snippets of folk tunes or just record the melodies. And as a result, some of the stuff that he collected lacked the verses. And so we now sometimes have the music without the text, just the tune. At this point, Vaughan Williams was now Dr. Vaughan Williams, but he still didn't feel like he had the full control over his compositional style that he wanted to have. He didn't feel like he'd blossomed into his own voice. Despite his training with Perry and Stanford, and then with Max Bruch in Berlin, he never felt like he was the composer he wanted to be or could be, and so he sought out more training. He eventually found this training in the form of the French composer Maurice Ravel. Ravel was never someone who enjoyed taking on pupils, in part because the only style that Ravel thought he could teach was his own style. Famously, he turned down George Gershwin, who was looking for lessons, because he told Gershwin that all he could do was turn him into a second-rate Ravel. But Vaughan Williams already had a pretty good idea of where he wanted his music to go, and he was a lot more mature just in terms of age than many of the other composers who were looking to study with the great French master. As a result, Ravel would go on to call Vaughan Williams his only pupil who didn't write his music. Vaughan Williams was not overshadowed by Ravel's influence, and he used his time with Ravel as a way of refining the things that he already knew how to do, but just wanted to make them crystal clear. His time with Ravel affirmed and clarified, and made more confident, his use of the things that he loved the most in his music, which included a lot of elements of the British tradition, not just church music and not just choral music, and not just the modal melodies of the folk songs he collected, but also the modal melodies of Elizabethan-era pieces. If you've played a piece by Vaughan Williams, chances are good, especially if you're a string player, that it was his Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, a 1910 piece for string orchestra, orchestrated as if it's an organ. He was unafraid to use the music of this famous Elizabethan composer as the basis for his own, indicating that he was confident that what he was able to do with this music would shine through. And indeed, the critics loved it, but they couldn't quite classify it. It was clear that these ancient, archaic modal melodies were shining through his texture, but it was so weird and modern that it wasn't necessarily just a pastiche of this old style. He took something of the past that he loved and he injected it with a new life and a new style. And this was what helped put him on the map. Now, if you're wondering who wrote the first fully choral symphony, that is the first symphony where the vocal and choral elements are used in every single movement, then a good guess would be Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 8, the so-called Symphony of 1000. It's not a bad guess, but technically that honor goes to Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 1, known as AC Symphony. It was written a little bit earlier, and it was premiered like maybe a month before Mahler's was. This might be one of the best first symphonies of all time. If you think about a lot of famous composers and their first symphonies, a lot of them don't necessarily stack up to what they did later in their careers. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Tchaikovsky even, a lot of these pieces are great pieces on their own terms, but when you compare them to later entries in the genre by the same composer, they just don't hold a candle to them. The list of composers for whom their first symphonies are standout pieces is a much smaller list and includes composers like Mahler, as well as Prokofiev, and in this case, Vaughan Williams. But the C Symphony really stands out as a weird piece, even when you look at Vaughan Williams' completed symphonic output. He never again wrote such a big piece for such a big orchestra with such a huge chorus and soloists. It stands out because it's part symphony, part cantata. I don't know, I think it's his best symphony. Not to diss any of the others, but I'm a sucker for Beethoven 9 and Mahler 2 and 8, so maybe I just like those big choral orchestral sounds, I don't know. Vaughan Williams did hit upon something of a unique British orchestral style. This includes the elements of unabashed diatonicism, lilting folk-inspired melodies, as well as unusual key relationships, especially those that theorists call
chromatic mediums.
For an example, we have to look no further than the opening fanfare of a C Symphony, which starts with a B-flat minor triad which resolves to a D major triad. These are tonal chords, but this is not a relationship you see in traditional tonal music. B-flat minor is pretty much as far away from D major as you can get on the circle of fifths, but the progression of one chord to the other is powerful because there are a bunch of half steps that aren't all moving in the same direction. So the voice leading is actually pretty good, even though the tonal relationship is unexpected. The early days of the 20th century can be understood as a bunch of composers trying to find their own style. On the one hand, you had composers like Schoenberg and his pupils who pursued more and more atonality before codifying that in the 12-tone system. But you also had composers like Debussy and Paul Hindemith, and in this case, Vaughan Williams, who decided that they were going to use traditional tonal relationships, tonal chords, tonal intervals, but not necessarily use the whole tonal package. So in the broad sense, we can understand Vaughan Williams as someone who was aware of these new developments, but was not necessarily someone who wanted to completely reinvent the wheel. He was comfortable just injecting a new spice into something that already existed. He was already seen by the British public and by other composers who were of a younger generation than he was as something of a savior of British music. They were no longer the land without music. Although, to credit this as solely a Vaughan Williams thing is an understatement. There's also Holst and many other composers of this era who helped bring British music from just being this insular church organ choral music thing into something that was more broad and more international. In terms of Vaughan Williams' internationalism, the texts for a C Symphony are taken from the poetry of Walt Whitman, which was, of course, one of his favorite poets at Cambridge and at the Royal College. Vaughan Williams was perfectly fine with cutting down some of the Whitman poems to size so we could tell a better story through the movements. After all, in the piece, A Voyage Over the Sea is compared with, and really an allegory for, humanity's voyage through life. Obviously, my personal fondness for the First Symphony does not mean that his other symphonies are lesser. They're just, in many cases, different. Vaughan Williams was a fairly consistent symphonist throughout the course of his compositional career. His pieces aren't really bunched up towards one end or another. He was also prone to recycling his material if he felt like he didn't squeeze all of the juice out of it in its original incarnation. Take, for instance, his Seventh Symphony, also known as the Sinfonia Antarctica, completed in 1952. It is so called because all the music from this is taken from the score to a film he wrote, which was based around the Antarctic voyage of explorer Robert Scott. Unlike some later composers who looked down on film music purely for being film music for some reason, Vaughan Williams really enjoyed the process, saying that it was the fulfillment of the wildest possible Wagnerian fantasy. Richard Wagner had believed in something called a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, and the film, to Vaughan Williams, was the closest thing that humanity could ever come to that, and probably was until we invented virtual reality. In 1914, the 42-year-old Vaughan Williams would have easily been passed up for military service, but he felt a duty to his country, and he signed up anyway. Like his teacher Ravel, they put him in the ambulance corps, and so he saw some of the worst of the fighting without ever actually fighting himself. During the war, he became close friends with fellow composer George Butterworth, and was very distraught after Butterworth was killed in action at the Battle of the Somme. Vaughan Williams ended up dedicating his second symphony to Butterworth's memory, because, as he said, without Butterworth's guidance, suggestions, and just helpful hints, that piece would never have seen the light of day in the form that we know it. Vaughan Williams wrote Holst that he dreaded the idea of normalcy after the war. He didn't understand how that could even be thought of as a remote possibility, given that so many had died. Yet Vaughan Williams still continued to serve, eventually working his way up to become a lieutenant in the artillery corps. Vaughan Williams was not compositionally active during the war for obvious reasons, and afterwards he decided that he wanted to get back into the swing of things. Unlike Ravel, who was so shaken by the hellish experiences of his time in the ambulance corps that he was reduced to one piece a year, Vaughan Williams was still bubbling with musical ideas. He just didn't have the time or the wherewithal to be able to write them down, understandably. He wanted to settle down and start writing a lot of pieces, and lo and behold, the Royal College of Music called him up and said that they wanted him to be on the faculty. And so for the next, very many years, he settled down into a predictable pattern of teaching and composing. He was known to occasionally call upon unusual ensembles, and often wrote in forms that worked but defied convention. Take, for instance, Flos Campi, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, a piece for solo viola, chamber orchestra, and chorus. It's sort of a viola concerto, but the viola part is not especially hard. It's not a choral piece, because there's no text setting, they just sing wordlessly, and it's more part of the texture. It's not a religious work, even though all the movement titles come from verses from Song of Solomon. Like I said, have at it, it just defies regular convention and regular forms. But yet it's consistently ranked as one of Vaughan Williams' best pieces. Later in his career, he'd go on to write a concerto for tuba, a set of songs for voice and oboe accompaniment, and a piece for harmonica, strings, and piano. We're not even going to talk about the piece for 4 recorders. But these pieces all came later. By the 1930s, he was British music. All the other major contenders for that title had passed away, leaving Vaughan Williams, then in his 60s, as the sole inheritor of the elder statesman mantle. The younger generation looked up to him and what he did in each successive piece, but he certainly felt some inner turmoil that he had no colleagues of his generation with whom he could talk. His 4th symphony was so violent that people thought that it had something to do with an extra musical program. The most common thought was that it had something to do with the right-wing nationalistic movements that were at that point gaining traction all across Europe. He was certainly profoundly anti-fascist, and he put his money where his mouth was. He used his status to lobby for increased refugee intake and protection in England, and he also opened up his home to refugees who were fleeing the Nazis. As the composer grew older, and Europe seemed on the brink of descending into war once again, Vaughan Williams found it increasingly hard to compose. Complicating matters was his ailing wife, Adeline. They had moved to the countryside sometime prior to accommodate her increasing arthritis. When the poet Ursula Wood called upon Vaughan Williams to discuss an idea for a potential ballet, the two fell in love. Ursula was soon thrust into the unusual and we can only imagine extremely awkward situation of helping in Adeline's care. She moved in with the couple in 1942, after her husband died. Yeah, I should have mentioned that both parties were married in this scenario. Though certainly an odd arrangement, it appears that Ursula and Adeline had nothing but affection for one another. Vaughan Williams' musical output, once very prolific, seemed to settle down into a steady pace, not writing very often, but occasionally coming out with a pretty big piece. His 6th symphony outstripped his 4th in terms of sheer aggressiveness, and it too was considered to have a kind of extra musical meaning. Vaughan Williams never denied outright that this piece, or any of his other pieces, had extra musical connotations, but he warned against people reading too much into his music, saying that sometimes a guy just wants to write a piece. Vaughan Williams was 78 when his wife died, and he was 79 when he married Ursula. She, by contrast, was a month shy of her 42nd birthday. Vaughan Williams continued to compose, mostly symphonies with a few vocal works thrown in, but he dedicated more and more of his time to promoting the music of the younger generation. He completed 9 symphonies and thereafter died, quite suddenly, in August 1958, at the age of 85, the day before his 9th symphony was to have its premiere recording. Vaughan Williams was most at home plying his trade in larger forms, and was as comfortable in the established forms as he was in inventing new ones. One would think that starting out with the cantata/symphony, a C symphony, would lead to a career full of form breaking, especially when you consider these other unusual pieces in his oeuvre. But all in all, he was as comfortable writing in the established forms as he was in doing new stuff. Chamber music was never his strong suit, and while it's not necessarily any worse than his larger pieces, he just didn't write a whole lot of it. And the reason he didn't write a whole lot of it is because he would write these big pieces, and they would get a lot of acclaim, and so he would put more and more of his efforts into writing those big pieces. Whereas he never got the same sort of adulation for his chamber pieces, and so he never had the impetus to write more and more of those. Since people liked his large-scale pieces, and he ended up going from success to success in those forms, he thought, well, no reason to abandon a gravy train. He had a great affinity for the sound of the viola, echoing the spirit of the age. Composer, violist, and fellow Stanford pupil Frank Bridge was active at this time, as was the violist Lionel Tertis, and together they helped break the common misconception that the viola was the unloved middle child in the string family. They, through their compositions and through their performances, elevated the viola to the status of a true soloist. Though he was very good in large forms and always seemingly was working on some kind of operatic project, Vaughan Williams was never a breakout star in the opera world, which doesn't say anything bad about Vaughan Williams and his dramatic integrity per se, but has a lot to do with bad luck in terms of libretti he chose and the fact that he lived through 2 world wars, which meant that there were 2 large chunks of his life where his country was financially incapable of putting up those big kinds of productions. Vaughan Williams was, by many accounts, a kind and charitable man who wasn't too full of himself. He served his country even when he didn't have to, and went deaf late in life as a result of his proximity to the artillery he commanded. And he even refused to be knighted for his services to his country and his art. His status, like Rachmaninoff and even Richard Strauss, was often denigrated for being a holdover, a romantic, a tonalist in the era of atonality. But his works, like those other composers, were always popular with audiences, and so Vaughan Williams was ripe for rediscovery by the generation of composers who came after the serialists and wanted to find something new and fresh as a starting point. He was also an important figure for the establishment of a particularly English musical identity. He said that music was an expression of a nation's soul, and that it was a fundamental part of everyday life. For Vaughan Williams, music was egalitarian and spiritual, but it was also hard work. It is in his self-criticism and myriad revisions that we see a composer very finely tuned to the intricacies of his craft.